Is my guest, tax attorney at Tax Consulting SA. If you've been working from home over the last 6 months or over the last 4 months, in fact, because that's how long the lockdown period has been, please, this is the time for you to listen and to find out whether or not you can claim from SARS for this situation. Darren Britz is my guest. Darren, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time, sir.
No, thank you, Aubrey. Thanks for having me.
So we've been debating. I mean, this is a conversation that has been happening as lockdown has been progressing as to what it is you can claim for now that we find ourselves forced to work from home in many instances. What are some of the claims that SARS allows us to make in this scenario?
Look, well, I think it's important to know that if you're a salaried employee, your claims are very limited. You know,
Sure.
I mean, you ought to realize what you're trying to claim is your expenses or your home expenses against your income to reduce your tax burden. You know, so it's very few expenses you can really claim as an employee. But if you can get past the strict tests, then you can claim a portion of your rent or perhaps your bond interest if you own your home. You can claim a portion of your water and electricity, repair costs, and those sort of costs affiliated with your home.
So somebody phoned one time and asked me, I mean, this was the father of a young lady that works at home, and asked, can he claim from the employer of this young lady some of the resources or some of the monies that have been used on resources such as electricity and so forth. I want to start there, Darren, before I go to SARS. Is there a logic, a rationality for a father whose daughter works from home over this time to be able to claim from the employer?
Certainly that's the case. An employee should never be expected to fund what we call business expenses or your employer costs from your own pocket, you know.
Yeah.
It's one thing to say, you know, I'll fund it initially, I'll pay from my own pocket, and I'll recover that from my employer or be reimbursed for those expenses. You know, that's perfectly appropriate and encouraged. But to expect an employee to cover their own business expenses is certainly, I would say, unacceptable in terms of South Africa where we are now. Especially employees really need to find a saving somewhere.
Yeah. Help me just with the details of that. Would the father be entitled to claim from the employer of the young lady, or is he to perhaps say to his daughter, I'm claiming from you, then you claim from your employer? How should the value chain work, as it were?
You know, it does become complex, Aubrey. The real trick would be from an employer perspective to have all these things ironed out up front. You know, the employer should have a policy and an agreement with that employee up front to say, look, we anticipate going forward you're more likely to incur these home expenses or these business expenses from your home. So look, this is the procedure we're going to follow going forward. So all of that should be communicated right up front. But if you're saying, look, it was an unexpected business expense, we didn't see it coming, and the employee herself didn't cover that cost, I think it will be quite difficult for the father then to recover that from the employer. You know, because again, privity of contract, you know, the employment relationship is between the employer and the employee. All negotiations and discussions in terms of costs and contractual obligations are really between those two parties, you know.
Yeah.
So if a third party, you know, out of the kindness of their heart starts to cover that cost for their child, I don't think it'll be as easy to recover that from the employer, you know.
Yeah.
Perhaps a greedy employer might just say, well, too bad, you know, if that's your decision, you know, then you must bear that cost.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I would encourage that the employer be approached with those expenses for that to be recovered. But again, the employer should be approached before those expenses are incurred, not after the fact.
Yeah. 011-883-0702. But I suppose then, Darren, many employers, indeed even SARS itself, may even argue that none of this was anticipated. Nobody thought that we would have a situation where the whole world was on lockdown, people working at home in the way that it's happened. So nobody could have anticipated that this would have happened, and therefore wouldn't have been able to pre the use of those resources go and say, I'm anticipating using so many hours on the phone or whatever the case may be. I'm just suggesting that the novelty of this experience would have been unanticipated.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think this is where we can be a little bit disappointed perhaps with SARS in terms of their guidance on this, I see this last week. SARS did give guidance to say if you work from home for 6 months of the year, you may be eligible for home expenses. It was one comment made. But really what we would have looked forward to is a detailed note, perhaps giving guidance to employers and employees on how to navigate this. When can you incur expenses? What can an employer do? What are your obligations as an employer? I think they would have gone a long way to perhaps give some clarity to this, Yeah. Otherwise, you're left with, two people, an employer and employee, that have to negotiate. And, if the employer has all the bargaining power, it becomes very difficult for that employee to try and recover those costs.
Yeah. All right, let's go into the relationship of the employer and SARS and what the employer can claim under which conditions. But before we even do that, Darren, let's talk about the fundamental, the basic rationale for claiming anything from SARS. Why are we able to claim stuff from SARS? What is the rationale behind that?
Yeah, so we've got a dedicated part of our Income Tax Act, which governs called deductions or deductions of expenses. It's Section 11 of the Income Tax Act. And the rationale is if you're conducting a trade, which includes employment, you are entitled to deduct costs you incur in the pursuance of that trade. So again, if you're an employee, far more limited in terms of what you can and can't claim, because it's assumed your employer is covering business expenses and you're simply earning your salary.
Yeah.
But you can imagine business people and more common, independent contractors and other trade people who have to incur their own business expenses. They have a far wider list of what they can and can't claim, But from an employee perspective, the principle is the same. If you're incurring business expense, you should have to claim that back where your employer doesn't cover that cost.
So let me see if I understand you correctly.
Mm.
In terms of the law, we are entitled as employees, business people, in the pursuance of commercial trade of whatever form, and that includes employment, right, to claim from SARS any expense that we may have incurred in that pursuit.
So yes, that's correct. But for employees, there's a second part to that. It's a different section of the Act. It's what we call Section 23, and that then limits that right to only claim certain expenses. So that section won't apply to independent contractors, or rather only a portion of that will apply. But if an employee, that Section 23B especially is very strict, and it limits your expenses to very few. But you're right, you've got all correct.
You see, Darren, I ask these questions because I think a lot of us just get caught up in the automatic sort of treadmill of the commercial world, the law, and the things that happen to us, just in terms of how we relate to SARS and other institutions of the same kind, that we don't really understand the rationale. We don't understand what is it that we are actually paying for or claiming for. So you're saying to me that there is a fundamental rationale, and that the way that you've just explained it to us is how we can approach it. And so even when we fill in our tax returns and we claim anything, it must be based on a fundamental understanding of the rationale for why you can claim anything from SARS, yeah?
Yeah, I agree fully. And I think it is a massive obligation on employers, and we have seen it, so I can't discount what's already happened. But there's a massive encouragement on employers to look at every opportunity to assist employees in reducing their tax obligations and recovering these expenses, That's very important to understand that rationale, especially from the employer perspective. Yeah. As you say, an employee is often passive. They sort of earn their salary or their income, and they just go about their duties, They don't perhaps think consciously about what they're spending that salary on, I recall when I was a candidate attorney at a law firm, back in the day, I would incur petrol costs to go to the court to file papers. And fortunately, my principal was a good guy, and he always reimbursed me at the end of the month for my petrol costs. But I can imagine a situation where an employee perhaps is just ignorant or not thinking, where they incur that business expense, they pay for their own petrol, they perform a task on behalf of that employer, and not even realizing that really that cost should be incurred by the employer. So that rationale is fundamental to, I think, employee.
Let's zoom in on that specific issue. So the petrol costs by an employee in the pursuance of the tasks that have been given to him by the employer, including coming to work or leaving from work to go back home, are things that employers can claim from SARS?
Yeah, so unfortunately, from your home to office is not considered as expense. That's considered a private expense from the employee side. Quite tough, but that is the position legally. But yes, if you at any time are required to incur your own expense for petrol and you're incurring for a business task, certainly that should be funded by the employer, and you should request a reimbursement there. In more sophisticated employment agreements and structures, your employers will actually structure what we call an allowance, into your agreement,
yes,
where they give you a cash amount or a petrol card or something similar to cover those expenses up front. That obviously becomes far more complex. But where you just, from time to time incurring these costs as your anticipated costs, definitely you should be seeking a reimbursement from your employer. It's really unfair to expect an employee to cover that. You should not really you should receive your cost to company as agreed in the employment agreement. If you have business expense, you reduce that net amount in your pocket.
Yeah. So let's go into the issue of the lockdown reality of working from home over the last 4 months. As you know, Darren, many of us had to start working from home as a result of the fears that came about as a result of COVID-19. Give me a list and perhaps a rationale for some of the things that we can claim from SARS under those conditions, under those realities.
Yeah, it's a bit tough, Aubrey, because that home office expenses claim really isn't for your average employee who's just working from home. What it actually is intended for is an employee who uses a particular part of their home, so for example, a room in their home, exclusively for work. So where you've, equipped or kitted out a part of your home or your premises for work, let's just call it one room in your home, or perhaps a bigger part of the premises, those really are the employees who are going to get a claim. Those of us that are kind of using makeshift arrangements, either working just from our kitchen counter or perhaps just your kitchen table or your living room, wherever you might be sitting, unfortunately, you're typically disqualified from your claims. The rationale from a SARS perspective is that, look, if we understand that you've dedicated a part of your home to your home office or to your work, then we will allow you to claim a percentage of your home costs or your home expenses against your income.
Isn't that a little short-sighted, given the reality that we're dealing with right now, especially over COVID-19? And I'm led to feel, Darren, that then this is not necessarily new, because I know of people that have had home offices for the longest of time. So this particular regime isn't anything new, but isn't SARS understanding that many people over this lockdown period, over the last 124 days, would have had to dedicate or would have had to work from home, and because they didn't dedicate a piece of their home to that particular function, would have been working from the kitchen table?
I agree. And I mean, there's a lot to be said for the tax relief measures SARS have put in place. And we know it's a careful balancing act between giving relief to, your average taxpayer and allowing government to collect revenue, But it would have been nice to see that perhaps that home office expenses section expanded or some temporary relief provision granted to say, look, if you can prove you've worked from home for a certain period of time, let's alter that provision, or let's temporarily alter it or widen that scope and allow you to claim more expenses. But for now, unfortunately, that employee has to seek relief from the employer. And I mean, you make a good example. If I'm at home 24 hours a day and I'm incurring more electricity and more water, can I ask my employer to cover a portion of that cost? Or rather, can I expect them to cover a portion of that cost? It won't be an easy discussion, I certainly can say I've heard none of my clients or employer clients that have covered that cost. It's different when you're talking petrol or perhaps airtime, printing costs, internet costs, cell phone. Those things are a bit more common. We understand those, from an employer perspective. But your general home expenses, it's not very common for employer to cover some of that cost,
Give us a call, 011-883-0702. Are you working from home? Have you been wondering whether or not you can claim some of those expenses from SARS? That's what Darren Britz is here for. He's a tax attorney at Tax Consulting SA. Linda is in Diepkloof, Soweto. Hi, Linda.
Hey, intellectual giant.
Yeah, man. How you doing, Linda? Are you well?
I'm right. And yourself?
Excellent, man. What's your question for Darren?
So I'm going to ask 3 questions. I'm going to be quick.
Very quickly.
3 different contexts, yeah?
Go ahead, yep.
Sure, Linda.
Okay. So the first context is I'm an employee and I am renting, right? So where I'm renting, I have my own prepaid, and I have to pay that prepaid for the electricity that I'm using, right? So how do I get provision on that? That's the first question. With my landlord, in a line with SARS. And then the second question in my second context is that when you are an entrepreneur and you're running a business from home, there are certain costs that you even mentioned, and those costs are telephone bills and of course using electricity, storage, and all of those things. How do you get any tax returns or tax revenues on that if you are not leaving any paper trails in terms of using any digital ways of trading or purchasing, especially in the informal sector? And then my third question on a different context is you having investment with commercial banks and them not actually providing you with the service or plan that they said they will cater for you, and then they don't do that. Can you also get tax revenues on that on corporate legislative way? Yeah.
Okay. Linda, thanks very much. Darren, I don't know where you want to start, but go for it.
Yeah, I think I might have missed that third one. So to understand the first question, you're saying you're renting, you're paying rent, you've got prepaid electricity. Is the question, can I claim this cost against my income from?
Linda, is that the question?
Yes. Let's say I have a landlord. So I have a landlord, and she bills me for using more electricity. Is it possible for me to claim tax revenue on that because I'm working from home? Are you with me with that?
Yeah, so I think I'm with you. Just tell me if I'm wrong. But the test remains the same. It's still a very tough test. It's still not, remember, it's not working from home allows me to claim these expenses. The test is going to be the same. Have I dedicated a part of my home exclusively to work? So i.e. a part of your home that you're not using partly for your private use or your kids or your family or anything like that. Is there a part of your home that you're using only for business expenses? If you can show that, then certainly you can claim a proportion of that electricity cost. But if you're saying, look, I'm just working from home, Darren, then no, unfortunately, SARS will not allow any claim from your home expenses. It's a very tough provision, but unfortunately that is the position that stands,
What does that look like in practical terms, Darren? I mean, let's say I'm not the guy who has the 4-bedroom plus study house, right? I have a 3-bedroom house, but I've been working on the table in the dining room for the last 4 months, right? But I really have been incurring costs and expenses that are related to this business as a result. What do I do? Do I put like some screens around the vegetable section of the table? What do I do? How do I do that practically in order for me to be a candidate for this relief?
Yeah, well, you're asking the difficult questions, unfortunately. It is case by case. I mean, for example, I've seen where SARS have verified someone's home office and they've asked for photographs of the home, Yeah. So, again, you don't have to use a room. So I do appreciate the example of, look, I'm not using a room, I'm kind of using a portion of my home. Again, the test is the same. If you can show that you've sort of fenced off, let's call it 5 meters of your home, or 5 meters squared of your home, and you can show that no one else goes in that little 5 meter section, and you can show you've got a desk there, you can perhaps show you've got your laptop or your computer there, whatever you use in the services you conduct, and you can show that to SARS, then yes, what you do is you claim a portion of your home expenses. And how that looks practically is that you have to measure that portion of that home office, the size of that home office, against the size of your home in total. So the most common example is if my home is 100 meters squared and my home office is 10 meters squared, which is 10% of my home, then I can claim 10% of my home expenses. But yeah, it becomes very difficult, So going forward, I think it's important for guys to take extra measures if they want to claim a home office expense. Perhaps even chat with the employer and get something in writing from the employer to say, look, we've discussed it and we've agreed that you will maintain a home office, and in an employer letter, they can even perhaps say, we've discussed it and we've agreed you'll make, a portion of living room available. No one else from your family will use this portion. We agree we'll supply you with a desk and a computer to use there, and on this basis, this becomes a home office. Your SARS is actually, they are used to seeing documents and letters and things like that to prove your case. So an employer letter will go a long way, I believe, in helping that employee prove that they are maintaining a home office.
Give us a call, 011-883-0702. I'd like to hear from those of you who have been, I suppose, compliant with regards to these laws and how you've been doing it practically. Those of you who know how to, put your case forward to SARS, give us a call. I'd love to hear from you as to how you've actually done it in a practical sense on 011-883-0702 or 021-446-0567. What sort of claims have you made against the expenses that you incur, and have you received any funds from SARS as a result? Have you had any support from your employer in this regard? Give us a call on 011-883-0702. Typically, what is the percentage that you can claim for if you are working from home? And where does the basis emanate from? Is it your rates and taxes, your water and lights? What exactly do you use as a benchmark to be able to claim, Darren?
Look, if you're serious and you really are maintaining what we call a bona fide or bona fide home office, you can claim as much space as you are using exclusively for your home office. So, a good example is somebody that's perhaps, only living in one room and using their kitchen for their private use, and they've completely converted the rest of their property to a home office. Their lounge is somewhere where they allow the clients to sit and wait. The second bedroom they've converted to their conference room. Perhaps even the garden, they allow their clients to park there. If you really are using that portion of your home for your clients exclusively, remember that the requirement exclusively, then you can claim that entire portion of cost. So it doesn't matter whether you're using 70% or 80% of your home for a home office. You can then claim 80% of your home office expenses against your income.
Do you see how this regime locks out a huge portion of the working population in this country, Darren. I mean, I think you started off by saying that this is a very exclusive sort of regime. But do you see how it just locks out so many thousands, maybe millions of South Africans from the benefits of being able to claim this way?
Yeah, well, I think the question becomes, Aubrey, how common is it before COVID that South Africans employees were working from home? Yeah. And from my experience, I could be wrong, but from my experience, it's not that common. If you've got an employment agreement that's strictly sort of salary, and you're not a salesperson or a commission-based earner, it's very rare to find that employee working from home, Yeah. There's not many positions that permit that. But if you're talking in terms of a COVID reality, then I agree with you. The law is deficient. But again, that's where we were looking to SARS for tax relief or tax relief measures, Yeah. And again, the relief measures they did impose didn't really help your average employee.
Yeah. Which was part of what the president announced right at the beginning when he told us about the relief, relief that would be in the hands of SARS for taxpayers. That taxpayers would be given this kind of relief. It appears, from what I'm hearing from you, that while the announcement was made, the thinking and the practicalities didn't go far enough to be able to serve the majority of South Africans that have found themselves having to work from home as a result of COVID-19?
No, I'd agree with you. It appears the main primary target of SARS was small businesses and employers. So some of the relief we saw was, for example, an SDL, Skills Development Levy holiday. We saw a deferral of employees' tax. The employer could wait 3 or 4 months before they have to pay that over to SARS. We saw a part deferral of income tax for small businesses. And we saw obviously a bit of relief on sin taxes, which is less relevant. But yeah, in terms of your home office or your employee working from home, there were not really strict provisions put in place or tax relief provisions put in place to help these people. The relief was more given to the employer, who has to sort of bear the burden of the costs of employment income.
So if I understand you correctly, the best way to perhaps give yourself the opportunity and the prospect of getting this kind of relief and being able to claim from SARS is you probably need to tag team SARS. You and your employer and your employer would need to sort of, in some way or another, tag team SARS by giving each other agreements, or let me say rather maybe from the employer, agreements and documents and letters saying that, one, you are working from home over the last 4 months, and you have incurred certain expenses from which you are now claiming from SARS.
No, well, remember, Aubrey, unfortunately working from home is not enough. So you'll be automatically disqualified for those expenses unless you can show your exclusive use of a home office. For your average employee, their only relief is to seek that reimbursement from the employer. It's to approach your employer and say, look, these are the costs I've incurred. This is incurred because you've obliged me to work, and obviously the laws oblige me to work from home. This is in excess of what I normally would be paying. Please, employer, this is actually your cost. You need to reimburse me for that. And then remember, when the employer reimburses you that amount is also not taxable. If you're reimbursed for a strictly speaking business expense that you've incurred, that amount is also not taxable. Again, based on the rationale that an employee should not be incurring business expenses on behalf of the employer. From a SARS perspective, if you're an employee, you've got really no hope unless you have a dedicated home office. Unfortunately.
Can you claim for homeschooling, asks a listener.
Can you claim for homeschooling?
Yeah.
So, for example, if I'm incurring the
if
cost
I'm teaching
myself,
my kids at home, the work that I'm doing teaching my kids at home, can I claim for that?
Yeah, so it comes back to that same test. It's, am I incurring an expense in the production of my income or in the or in the production of my trade? So if my trade is, I'm an employee, I'm an accountant who works from home doing accounting, and I'm incurring certain costs which have nothing to do with my trade, then no, you're completely excluded from that provision. And that's before you even get to the limitations section, that section 23B we mentioned.
Yeah.
Under section 11, even under that, you'd probably be disqualified. So, for example, if I'm a businessman or a commission-based earner or a contractor, who've got far wider expenses that they can incur, even they would struggle to show that they can claim those expenses back. Because again, you're teaching your kids is not sort of aiding your trade.
Yeah. A listener on the WhatsApp line says, I have a friend who, apart from the more obvious claims like Wi-Fi, electricity, water, etc., during COVID-19 lockdown, even claims expenses incurred for coffee, sugar, and milk from her employer. Would that be kosher, Darren? And can that then be redirected to SARS as a claim?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Because I mean, if you're at your place of work or your place of employment at the office, and your employer is giving you tea and coffee, I guess you're accustomed to that as part of your perks of employment, if I can say that. And in terms of our law, where your employer provides you with drinks at the office, there is no tax for that employee. But in terms of reclaiming that from your employer, I imagine you could try. But again, it becomes then a discussion and a negotiation with your employer. I imagine your employer would most likely say, no, unfortunately, they will refuse to do that. We don't recognize that as a business expense because we don't require you to do that. Remember, the test will be, is the employer requiring you to incur that cost? So if I'm requiring you to work from 8 to 5 and to be on your computer and your internet, I'm requiring you then to incur electricity costs, requiring you to incur internet costs, cell phone costs, etc. That tea or coffee or similar expenses is your choice. It's not a requirement of the employer. But certainly you can try. You can. I mean, there's always an opportunity to have a conversation with your employer and practically and reasonably ask for some sort of reimbursement.
Yes.
But yeah, it won't be that easy, I think, on tea and coffee.
Well, no, I suppose
you can try.
Yeah, I'm sure you can. But what I'm getting from you, Darren, is that there are certain rules. And once you apply the rules, then the sky's the limit. I mean, you can then claim for anything as long as you apply the rules and you've got some sort of rationale and some sort of backup to what you're claiming. You can basically claim for anything as long as it is connected to the pursuance of the work that you do for yourself, either as an independent business person or as an employee for an employer.
Yeah, and I think the first caller alluded to that. He was saying, look, how am I proving these things? I think he mentioned informal trade. In informal settlements, and where perhaps there's less paperwork. And yeah, that becomes a massive challenge. You need to somehow be able to prove these expenses you're incurring.
Yeah.
So if it's a cash sort of business, you're incurring expenses out of cash. Perhaps little receipts, There's nothing wrong with taking out a piece of paper and with a pen writing out a receipt if you're incurring expense, or requesting a receipt from somebody you're incurring expense for, So I agree with you, Aubrey. If you can prove those expenses, it goes a long way, provided you meet the other requirements, it goes a long way to claiming that back.
Darren, how do people get in touch with you if they want to ask more questions around this matter?
No, they're welcome to. They can just reach me at my email address. It's probably the easiest. It's just my first name, Darren, DARREN, @taxconsulting.co.za.
Darren Britz.
But they're more than welcome.
Much appreciated. So Darren Britz, the tax attorney at Tax Consulting SA, really appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you, Aubrey. Thanks for having me.